Good morning. Welcome back now to the reading of God's Word. We are now midweek and we are going to finish up the book of Zechariah, and we'll look at the book of Malachi in this video. We did get through chapters 1 through 9 of Zechariah in the last video, and we got through the 8 visions that he had, and we began with the first oracle that he had, and we were discussing about that, the Maccabees that were overthrowing parts of the Greek. Anyway, they got into a lot of activity in that particular part of the oracle, looking ahead. These are future prophecies of things that are going to happen. And so it was, we were discussing that in the last video, the Maccabees. So we're going to continue with that here in chapters 10 and 11. Zechariah chapters 10 and 11 are a continuation of a lot that's going to happen. These are future prophecies that have yet to occur, and it goes all the way out, of course, to the Messiah and the millennial reign. In chapter 10, we talks about the complete cleansing then of Jerusalem and the joy of living in the land under the Messiah. And that is, as we look at that, there's never been a real time that Israel has had complete joy and freedom and without persecution. The last time they probably had that was under the King Solomon, and that was the heyday of Israel. Everything before that, even through King David, fighting the wars that he fought. And then after that with Jeroboam and Rehoboam, from then on the split kingdoms, there's been nothing but trouble. And that would go on really until 1948. If you think about it, Israel has never been without some degree of occupation or oppression. But anyway, he goes through all of this, saying that that day in chapter 11, that day in the millennial reign, they're going to finally get that peace. Chapter 11, he uses two staffs, union and favor, to represent the restoration of Israel and Judah, and that, of course, is going to happen in that millennial reign. It really kind of sort of happens here in this restoration that's going on there, because the northern kingdom is basically dissolved on this return from Babylon. It is Judah and Benjamin that come back, but there's remnants of all of the other tribes that are involved in this first restoration. But we see that even now the prophecy moves way ahead again, where the shepherd is rejected at the first advent of Christ. So already we're talking about Christ coming and the Messiah being cut off. We can go back to Daniel and see that in that 69th week of that prophecy, that the Messiah would be cut off, and he would go until that 70th week would come, which would be the week of the tribulation period. So chapter 12 through 14 all have to do with that battle, with the battle of Armageddon, the tribulation period, the final coming of the Messiah, and the full restoration, basically, of the nation as it's promised. The land and its borders. The borders of Israel were originally promised to be all the way from the Nile to the Euphrates River. And they will wind up saying, we still don't have enough room to live by the time the full restoration takes and all of Israel is in its millennial reign. It'd be a very different look in that region while Christ is there. And in chapter 13, verse 7, we see that the shepherd is cut off by the crucifixion. We see that the sheep are scattered, which represents the disciples who would eventually be the apostles. And those were scattered at that time. And that was right in front of what we know now as the church age. And we're going to move into that in the last video of this week. So then in chapter 14, Jesus returns to the Mount of Olives. He will take his position as king, and all the nations will come to him. And there's a plague for all of those who do not come. Read through that pretty carefully. That's pretty ominous plague that's going to, where people's eyes rot and their tongues rot and their skin falls off. There's pretty, you can get imaginative over that particular plague that's going to come upon people who do not call on the name of Christ during that millennial reign. So we get through Zechariah, very busy prophet. He had so much. Again, like I said in the first video, he could have been one of the major prophets by all of the information that is recorded here. So after that, we finally move to the last book in the Old Testament, Malachi. Now we're 100 years or so after Zerubbabel and Joshua had come to restore that. Since that time, Nehemiah had come to restore the walls. The altar had been replaced. The sacrificial system had started back up again. And Malachi comes down to the priest. And basically, he's putting his finger in the chest of all of the priests and saying, you are doing exactly what your fathers did, and you're going to get in trouble all over again. And he begins to point out everything that they were doing. And in particular, we look at in chapter 2, he talks about the marriages. This is the mixed marriages between the Jews and the Gentiles. And these, of course, are the women that they picked up from the Gentile nations or the local nations that were there, and those that were brought in from during that exile time. Not only were the Jews taken out of Israel, taken out of Jerusalem, and taken to Babylon, but there were other nations being brought in to replace them. So all of this happening here causes all of these mixed marriages to take place. But the laws of God, because we're still under the age of the law, prevents them from marrying outside their own the Jewish people. So they weren't supposed to do that. Then he got to talking about the divorces. So they were, marrying and divorcing pretty quick. This gets almost into the Sodom and Gomorrah kind of thing. But basically, God has always said he hated divorce. He does not like this divorce thing. But Moses let them divorce because of their own selfishness. So he allowed that. But he didn't. They're being talked about now, and Malachi is pointing to them, especially to the priest, because the priests are just as guilty as the rest of the population. Then finally, here in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, there is a direct reference. This is talking about Elijah, which is the direct reference to John the Baptist that is coming. And you'll hear Jesus talk about that. He said that, Elijah did come, but they did not recognize him. So Malachi now, 400 years before John the Baptist, is telling them that Elijah is coming. And then he says, and he's talking about the advent of Jesus, this first advent of Jesus that is coming. And then finally, and when in it, he says, and who can stand? Who can stand when he appears? There's a very strong warning here of the coming of the Messiah. And of course, they thought he was coming as king, but he came as the sacrifice in this first advent. And then in chapter 3, verses 13 through 15, we see the complete arrogance. It seems to suggest that they escape God's judgment, that God's judgment is asleep. They're not getting into any trouble. Nothing's really happening to them. But we know in Peter tells us in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 3, that God's judgment is not asleep, and it is coming. And here we are now beginning, this is 400 years before Christ. They were going to reject him. They were going to crucify him. All this is still coming under judgment as we see these prophecies being fulfilled. And then finally in chapter 4, Malachi chapter 4, and this ends up the Old Testament here. The nature of God's judgment, it's going to be complete. We're going to see the return of Elijah. Again, we just talked about that. And there's 400 silent years. And again, these silent years are not years that just nothing is happening. There's a lot that's happening. What this means, the 400 silent years, is, of course, God has now said all he's going to say in the Old Testament through prophets. He's done all he's going to do. He's given them their time now. God will not start again until when he gets into the apostles. And we get then the writings of the New Testament. And we're going to get into that in the next video. So finish out this Old Testament reading with Zechariah and Malachi, and you'll see that the stage is now being set for the coming of Christ. and the rejection of him. The first advent comes and goes, and we today are waiting on that second advent, all of us. So with that, I pray that you pray that you get all of the discernment that you can out of this and the prophecies that take place, and that from time to time, sometimes we can read these things and we get information that helps us in our own lives. As far as sin and punishment, well, this is a big lesson. They've been going through this for a long time, and let that be a lesson to all of us. So with that, may God bless the reading of his word.